hadn't been the best day for Ulrich from Neuheim. The large deer he had been tracking since morning stubbornly eluded the old hunter. Several times he got close enough to shoot, but at the last moment, the cautious animal would disappear among the yellowing leaves. Cursing everything under the sun, Ulrich had considered giving up and heading home empty-handed. But the silhouette of the deer with its large antlers, flickering among the trees, rekindled his hope. Consumed by the thrill of the hunt, the old man failed to notice how the shadows grew longer and stars began to light up the darkening sky. Only when the moon rose, silvering the forest-covered hills, did Ulrich realize he had strayed too far from home. The cursed deer was still somewhere nearby. Ulrich even saw its antlers flicker among the branches a couple of times, but continuing the chase was impossible. It was too late to head home, so the hunter decided to spend the night in the forest and resume the hunt in the morning. He doubted the deer would go far overnight. Fortunately, Ulrich knew of a cozy cave in the nearby foothills where he had taken shelter from bad weather before. He needed to hurry. Cold mist was already descending from the mountains, creeping like a pale ghost among the forested hills. Gathering some kindling along the way, Ulrich reached the cave, a water-worn hollow between the rocks, where he lit a fire. Pulling a piece of dried meat from the bag slung over his shoulder, he hungrily sank his teeth into it. After washing down the modest meal with spring water, Ulrich was about to stamp out the fire and sleep on the stones warmed by the flames when something strange caught his eye in the flickering firelight. The flames danced and fluttered as if about to extinguish, something that had never happened before. Ulrich moved closer, shielding the fire, and felt a wave of cold air against his back. The hunter turned around. Had it seemed, or had the far wall receded into darkness since his last visit? Grabbing a burning branch from the fire, the hunter ventured deeper into the cave. A few disturbed bats took off from the wall, heading towards a large crack that had opened in the far wall. Ulrich frowned as he approached. It had been a long time since he was last here, but he remembered there being nothing like this before. He raised the makeshift torch higher, carefully examining the cold-breathing fissure. Something glinted faintly on the stones. Ulrich bent down and picked up a silver coin with Spanish inscriptions, a full-weight New Navarrese peso. There were traces of candle wax and soot on the stones, and in the wet dirt of droppings and rain-washed dust was the print of a boot. Ulrich's head spun, and he leaned against the wall. These mountains were riddled with hidden paths used by smugglers who had long favored this borderland and often stashed their goods in local caves. A reward from Baron Manfred was due for pointing out such a lair, but there could be something to gain for himself. Besides, whoever had set up this hideout seemed to be absent now. Otherwise, they would have made their presence known by now. Carefully blowing on the dying flame, the hunter stepped inside. Darkness closed around him like a womb, the flickering firelight illuminating only the damp walls. Afraid of getting lost, Ulrich thought of turning back when the crack ended, and he found himself in a large cave among stalagmites and stalactites, merging into giant columns. Water gurgled somewhere below, and the squeaking of bats echoed from the stone vaults. Ulrich, of course, knew of the legendary Giant's Cave and realized he had stumbled upon some southeastern offshoot. Probably, underground waters had washed out the crack in the rock, connecting local lands with the famous subterranean labyrinths. The hunter raised his torch higher and froze, turning into one of the stone pillars himself. Right in front of him stood a huge stalagmite, towering above the rest like a mighty oak among young saplings. The sharp needle-like peak was crowned with a mutilated human body, like a beetle skewered by a shrike on an acacia thorn. The glassy brown eyes stared lifelessly at the hunter, frozen in horror. A strange rustling sound came from behind, followed by a nauseating stench hitting his nostrils. Shaking off his paralysis, Ulrich turned, tearing his double-barreled gun from his shoulder, but something struck him in the chest, sending waves of unbearable, excruciating pain through his body. Ulrich opened his mouth to scream, but only a gurgling gasp escaped his lips, now white with blood. From the corner of his eye he caught a glimpse of a white shadow with grotesque, misshapen outlines, and a huge eye with a vertical pupil flashed with a horrifying fire. Then a new pain, even more intense than the last, pierced Ulrich, and darkness swallowed him whole. A tall, blond man in an unremarkable black cloak stood on a rocky cliff, surveying the small valley below, overgrown with dense forest. Wisps of gray mist slowly descended from the hilltops, and a light rain fell from the sky. In the distance, the mournful howl of a wolf echoed. There was something melancholy and subtly frightening about this place, pressing with an inexplicable weight on anyone who found themselves here at this time of year. However, there was not a trace of anxiety on the traveler's narrow face. His cold gray eyes matched the gloomy sky. He knew this land well. The forested plateau carved by ravines and gorges, dotted with numerous lakes, rivers, and waterfalls. The superstitious settlers on both sides of the border populated these forests and caves with monsters. Forest spirits fond of human women, werewolves, dwarves guarding treasures at the bottom of caves, and other creatures born from the age-old imagination of common folk. Not all of these tales were idle gossip, but Willem van Hyn, a soldier of fortune from the Lake Country, was more concerned with earthly dangers, the kind that could be shot with the 2 multi-shot revolvers hanging from his belt, the pride of the Friesland Confederation's gun factories. Wolves, panthers, and bears roamed these forests, and poisonous snakes were not uncommon. Bandit gangs, smugglers, and runaway slaves from the Euskadi plantations also hid here. Local barons' patrols hunted them down, sometimes treating travelers no better than bandits themselves. On the other side of the border, the viceroy's soldiers of the mountain provinces of Euskadi behaved similarly, often crossing into neighboring territory. This is why the traveler scrutinized the distance closely. Was there smoke or any other sign of human presence? Satisfied that the surroundings were deserted, the Frisian began his descent. The slanting rain grew heavier as Willem entered the dense thicket. The ground was wet, and little streams gurgled here and there. Thick moss and the roots and ivy hanging from the slopes gave the valley a certain charm, though it was almost lost in the dreary, dull gloom. Willem spotted the deer around a bend in a small animal trail. The animal's carcass hung among the broken branches of a mighty larch tree, immediately catching the eye. Turning into all ears and constantly looking around, the Frisian approached the tree, noting that the deer was suspended at least 6 feet above the ground. Pushing aside the branches, Willem raised his eyebrows in surprise. He had seen people torn apart by predators, but no beast inflicted such wounds. It was as if huge jaws had chewed the body while a large bird pecked at it. The skull was split open with a single blow, and the brain neatly eaten out. A terrible wound gaped in the abdomen. The invisible predator had tried to reach the liver and heart. The rest of the body was covered in numerous round wounds or bites. And strangest of all, there was very little blood on the body. Neither bear nor panther could do this to a deer, not to mention that it would be difficult for them to haul an adult deer to such a height. The Frisian cautiously touched the torn flesh, rubbed a lump of clotted blood between his fingers, and brought it to his nose. The animal had been lying here for at least a day, but who knows if the unknown predator was resting in the bushes after a hearty meal? And wouldn't it want to resume its feast soon? What kind of creature could have done this? Willem couldn't fathom. His gaze accidentally caught the wet moss covering the ground under the tree. A chill ran down his spine as he remembered other legends of the local inhabitants. A large hoof print was clearly visible on the green carpet. The best thing Willem could do now was to reach the nearest settlement as quickly as possible. Casting one last wary glance around, the mercenary moved away. It was already getting dark when Willem van Hein reached the outskirts of Neuheim, the southernmost town in the Valberg Confederation. Once a bustling trading crossroads, it was now rapidly falling into decay after the revolution overthrew the kingdom of New Navarre and established the Republic of Euskadi in its place. Essentially, little had changed. Even the president was a relative of the deposed king. But the Confederation barons, frightened by the imperial revolution in the Old World, refused to have any dealings with Euskadi. This hit several border towns hard, including Neuheim, which was quickly turning into a large village. However, Willem was in no position to be picky. He decided not to enter the town itself. Citizens of the Friesland Confederation were still not welcome in these parts. The descendants of the brother knights of the Order of St. Walpurga Teutonic still held a grudge for the loss of the coast even 300 years later. And although the Confederation and Friesland now shared common enemies, the attitude towards Frisians in the Valberg hinterlands left much to be desired. Fortunately, Willem knew of a suitable place on the outskirts, the Red Wolf Inn. It stood on the road that had once been the main trading route, and here they were not yet unaccustomed to various travelers. The stuffed animal that gave the inn its name bared its teeth under a small awning, beneath which stood several horses, 3 or 4 peasant nags and a bay stallion, judging by its build, a purebred Floridian, a descendant of the Arabian horses brought 3 centuries ago. Willem raised an eyebrow in surprise. It was rare to see such a horse in these parts. I should have a word with its owner, thought the Frisian, climbing the steps of the inn and pushing the heavy door open. Inside was a large hall filled with tables that could seat 5 or 6 people each. The place had clearly seen better days. Currently, there were only 6 people in the entire inn. At one table sat a pair of peasants, slurping hearty meat stew and washing it down with local beer. At the next table, a burly man with a puffy face and a thick light beard was working his way through a rabbit stew. Across from him, a thin priest in a black cassock sipped wine absently. With the order dissolved, many barons had switched from Catholicism to Martinianism, but here in the remote provinces, they still remained loyal to the Holy See. Another guest, a red-haired giant, sat alone at a table in the corner by a lit fireplace. He wore leather trousers, a thick shirt, and a cloak clearly not of local make, adorned with patterned woolen trim. A large beer mug sat in front of him as he gnawed on a large ham bone. He looked decidedly out of place, and Willem realized he had found the owner of the Floridian. The 6th was a stocky man with a huge belly and muscular arms, standing at the bar. His bald head was ringed with curly blonde hair, and his small eyes lit up with interest at the sight of the Frisian. "Willem!" he boomed. "Damn it. Oh, excuse me, father," he added, turning to the priest. The latter nodded solemnly, casting a keen glance at Willem. "I'm glad to see you too, Kurt," Willem grinned, seating himself at the nearest table. "What do you have for me? Any good venison?" "Alas," Kurt shrugged. "Old Ulrich the hunter promised me a deer yesterday, but he vanished in the forest. But we have an excellent ham." "Bring it on," Willem nodded. "And some goat cheese, bread, and a pitcher of beer. No, make it a jug." Kurt nodded and disappeared through a side door. Willem sat by the fireplace and surveyed the tavern. The others paid him little mind, except for the red-haired giant in the corner. At the first sound of Willem's voice, he had turned and was now staring at the Frisian with squinted green eyes. Noticing Willem's attention, the guest smirked crookedly and made an inviting gesture. Willem shook his head, indicating the door where Kurt had disappeared, and the red-haired man, shrugging, returned to his interrupted dinner. Willem noted the bulge of a weapon under the man's cloak. It wasn't wise to travel these parts unarmed. The door clattered and a tray of food landed on Willem's table. Kurt followed with a jug of beer. "Honestly, I never expected to see you alive," Kurt said, seating himself across from Willem. "You were heading to Doria 3 years ago." "Doria," Willem scoffed bitterly. "There is no more Doria, Kurt. There's California, damned by the almighty California, and may it rot in hell. Though hell has already broken loose there. Black Amazons beating drums in the squares of New Liguria, drunken hymns to bloodthirsty gods resounding in the Doge's palace, and voodoo shamans divining by human entrails on cathedral altars." "I heard about that," Kurt shuddered. "Damn it. Since the Empire's fall, the world seems to have gone mad. I didn't think you'd come back from there." Neither did I. Scenes that still haunted Willem in his nightmares flashed before his eyes. Black smoke over palace roofs and cathedrals, the blood-red river teeming with gorged alligators, the frenzied flight through deadly swamps, the rhythmic beat of drums, and the impassive faces of his former comrades trailing behind. The faces of those who died fighting off the howling black devils. But he wouldn't share this with Kurt. Now it seemed unreal even to him. Willem shook his head to dispel the grim memories. "California is hell," he repeated, "and it is ruled by the devil. Or rather, a deviless in human form, with the body of Venus, but a heart blacker than her skin." "The Empress?" "Yes, Lucretia. Doge Vincenzo was a fool not to strangle his maid before she gave birth to that monster. He drained his mug in one gulp and bit into the juicy meat, trying to drown out the distressing memories with food and drink. I went to New Navarre," he continued after satiating his initial hunger. "But trouble started there too when the locals decided they were Basques, not Navarrese. I had no desire to fight for Prince Gonzalo, and then rumors of an impending war in the north reached me. So I headed home." "I went outside," Kurt remarked, "but I didn't see a new horse under the awning. Did you walk through the mountains?" "Not exactly," Willem replied with his mouth full of bread and cheese. "My horse managed to step on a snake in the mountains when I was less than a day's journey from Neuheim." "Thank God you made it by nightfall," Kurt said with feeling. "Your guardian angel must be getting double pay in the heavenly office. I wouldn't wish anyone to be left in the mountains, especially on this night. Not even a Frisian," he added. "Afraid old Richard will pay your inn a visit?" Willem smirked. "I bet he won't be as easygoing as I am." "It's not funny, Van Hine." Kurt shook his head. "You're an outsider and don't know these parts. It's no place for a Christian, even if he's just a Martinian and not a good Catholic, to be under the open sky on the night of the wild hunt of Magister Zalza." Among the many local legends and beliefs, some dating back to the time of the Oceanic Crusade, one of the most terrifying tales was the legend of Richard von Zalza, the third magister of the Walpurgis order. Deposed by his jealous rivals and insulted in his deepest feelings, the magister cursed God and devoted himself to the service of Satan. It was said he had allied with the original inhabitants of these lands, against whom the order had been founded. Fires burned on the hill slopes, and von Zalza, with his loyal knights, offered human sacrifices to long-forgotten gods. No one knew how he died. Rumor had it that the devil himself came to claim his soul at the appointed hour. But the peasants whispered that on a certain night in autumn, the gates of hell would open, and Richard von Zalza would lead the wild hunt. It was believed that on this night, all the evil spirits came out, and witches' spells were especially powerful. "Satan's spawn have already crawled out of hell, I swear by St. Michael," the innkeeper grumbled. "Yesterday 2 boys went squirrel hunting. They never returned. Old Ulrich is missing too, and if anyone knows this forest like the back of his hand, it's him." "Think the magister got them?" Willem feigned a smile, though unease crept into his mind as he recalled the deer killed by some unknown beast. "Maybe him, maybe one of his pack," Kurt shrugged. "Who can tell with the devil's children? But I'll tell you this, Frisian." Willem glanced over his shoulder and Kurt almost whispered, "It wasn't a good hour when that red-haired bastard showed up here." "What's wrong with him?" Willem asked. "Not him, but what he brought," Kurt shuddered. "In all my years at the Red Wolf, I've never seen such filth. If he hadn't paid in gold for 3 days in advance, though he's only staying 1 night, I'd never have let him through the door. And now I pray hourly for the Lord not to punish me for my greed." "What did he bring to your place?" Willem asked, intrigued despite himself. "Not what, but whom?" Kurt replied, standing up. "Go ask him if you want. I see you know each other. But I don't want to talk about it. Sorry, I need to tend to other customers." "Of course." Willem nodded absently. He finished the food on his tray, and getting up from the table, headed toward the red-haired giant. The priest in the black cassock gave Willem a heavy look, but remained silent. The red-haired guest looked up as Willem's shadow fell across his table. "Well, hello, O'Neill," Willem said, sitting down across from him. "Long time no see." "Not that long, Willem," his companion replied calmly. "How long has it been since you left the Legion?" 3 years? 4? 3.5? Willem nodded, sipping beer from his mug. "You should remember. Since the day I threw my badge with the royal seal and left, accompanied by cries of betrayal and broken oaths." "You really broke your oath then," O'Neill said slowly. "Because when I swore an oath to King Alfred, New Sussex was allied with the Commonwealth," Willem retorted. "In Europe we defended not only Old Friesland, but also Alfred's damned uncle, who lost 50,000 men at Waterloo alone. We retreated from The Hague, Calais, and Dunkirk alongside the English. We prepared to defend that cursed island when the Imperial Revolution fleet was ready to invade, and we were among the first to land in Brittany, Normandy, and Friesland. We took Dresden for God's sake." "And how did King Edgar repay us?" "First, he deposed the stadtholder in Old Friesland, putting that scoundrel Friedrich on the throne, and then he and his nephew wanted to seize the mouth of the Reverend Martin River. And you expect me to fight for someone who behaves like a treacherous coyote? Edgar may be busy in France now, but tomorrow—" "He's not busy anymore," O'Neill smirked. "They say he managed to get his man on the French throne, and now he's turned his attention to the New World. Rumor has it that Norwegian infantry is landing north of the Reverend Martin River. And you know what that means." "I know." Willem's face darkened. "Those beasts made a name for themselves at the taking of Hamburg and Vienna. If Edgar's deploying the Norman Guard, it means he's serious. This isn't just a conflict, it's a war of annihilation." "It seems so," the Irishman shrugged. "Edgar has long been frustrated that the Frisian River separates crown lands from his nephew and vassals' territories, and now the Russians are moving west toward Friesland. Already? Just 3 years ago they were crossing the Rocky Mountains." Well, it's the Russians, the Irishman laughed. They're greedier than a Dorian alligator. First, they gobble up all the land they can. Then they figure out why they need it. Now Tsar Boris's forts stand on Friesland's outskirts. And has there ever been a time in the past 500 years when the Russians didn't back the English? Those two bandits always work together, Willem said grimly. Poor Friesland. But still, he stubbornly shook his head. I hope to reach the Great Lakes before it's all over. And who says the English will crack the Frisian nut, even with the Russians? The barons of the Confederation will support the Commonwealth. They must understand that they'll be next. What about you, Patrick? Whose side will you take? My own, the Irishman smirked. I have no desire to fight for King Edgar, whose soldiers run rampant in Erie, but Friesland means nothing to me either. Fighting for foreign flags doesn't appeal to me, and I probably won't ever have my own. If I risk my hide, it'll be for something that pays well. In some ways, you're probably right, Willem said. What are you up to now? Hunting men, the Irishman replied calmly. Like in Maryland. Willem grimaced. But there are no runaway slaves in the Confederation. Almost no serfs left here either. Even old Manfred von Richthofen's father freed all his serfs. I won't stay in this dump for long, O'Neill laughed. I'm heading to Euskadi tomorrow. Runaway slaves are a thing of the past. Now I deal in specialty goods. Is that why Kurt's so on edge? Willem asked. Superstitious oaf, the Irishman sneered. What can you expect from him? Back home, we also talk a lot about tonight. We call it Samhain. But our demons stayed in Europe. These local ones don't scare me. What matters more is that a count in Euskadi promised me gold by weight for this prize. Will you show me what's causing all the fuss? Willem asked, noticing the Irishman's face change. Don't worry, I don't intend to take it. I need to get to Friesland as quickly as possible, and dealing in human trafficking is a dirty business, in my opinion. It won't be easy to take this prize from me. O'Neill smirked. Besides, having it isn't enough. You need to know someone who can appraise it and pay accordingly. The hunter's face showed a mix of caution and pride in his catch. So if you're not afraid... After California, it's hard to scare me, Willem grinned. But you've piqued my interest. I'd like to see the prisoner who makes the innkeeper fear for his immortal soul and has a count in Euskadi ready to pay a fortune. Show me. The Irishman nodded, finished his wine, and stood up, gesturing for Willem to follow. The other patrons barely noticed their departure, except for the priest, who watched them with pale blue eyes full of concern. You won't deny, dear friend, the Irishman said, that there are beings, not human, not beast, but strange creatures born from miserable, lustful, fanciful thoughts. Hans Heinz Uvers Alrauna. The Irishman and the Frisian climbed the creaky stairs to the second floor, where the guest rooms were. A dim glow from the end of the corridor barely dispelled the darkness. Luckily, it's just us here, the Irishman said, striking sparks with a flint and pulling out a candle. And it's always dark here. Luckily? Why? Because my goods spoil in the light, O'Neill smirked, lighting the candle. You'll see for yourself. An increasingly perplexed Willem followed the Irishman down the corridor, stopping at one of the doors. The key turned with a grating sound, and the door swung open. The Irishman made an inviting gesture and stepped inside. The room was small and sparsely furnished, just a wooden cot with a fabric mattress. Opposite the wall was a large window covered with thick black cloth. Willem realized it was a blanket taken from the cot. O'Neill had done everything to let in as little light as possible. On the floor under the window, a thin white figure was curled up. Hearing the door open, it stirred, and a metallic clink was heard. "Well, take a look." The Irishman stepped forward, bringing the candle closer. Willem was hard to surprise with the sight of a naked woman, but even he couldn't suppress a gasp at the sight of the prisoner shrinking into a dark corner. Her skin seemed to glow with a deathly white light, reminiscent of the phosphorescence of rotting wood, fireflies, or will-o'-the-wisps. A similar pale glow flickered on her long, light hair, covering her body down to her thighs. Flowing and curling with every slight movement of the girl, the hair seemed to live its own life. Through the strands, delicate breasts with bright red nipples were visible. The flawless, sculptural perfection of the body seemed free of any flaws, as did the face. Beautifully shaped lips, a graceful chin, marred only by excessive pallor. No man could look at this girl without feeling desire, but it would be shameful and unnatural. For in this beautiful and terrifying creature, there was something subtly inhuman. This impression was heightened by her small, upturned nose, whose delicate nostrils constantly quivered as if sniffing. The prisoner's eyes were covered with a thick black blindfold, and her hands and feet were shackled with heavy chains, one end of which was attached to the cot's leg. "Well," the Irishman whispered with obvious pride, "isn't she lovely?" "And who is she?" Willem asked. "Have you ever heard of the cave people?" the Irishman answered with a question. "That's just fairy tales," Willem exclaimed. "Are you saying that?" "Look." The hunter stepped forward and, before the girl could recoil, tore off her blindfold. Willem involuntarily stepped back. He had never seen such eyes, pale gray, merging with the whites, with what seemed like a black pinprick in the center. In those terrible eyes, there was nothing human, the focused gaze of a predator stalking its prey. Just imagining what this cave girl might be thinking made the battle-hardened mercenary shiver. As if sensing his unease, the girl lifted her upper lip in a ghastly grin, revealing well-developed sharp teeth. "Don't look at her too long," the Irishman warned, stepping forward and placing the candle on the cot. The girl shrank back to the wall, clinking her chains, but O'Neill grabbed her hair, forcing her head back and preventing her from biting his hand. With his free hand, he replaced the blindfold over her eyes. The entire time, the girl didn't make a sound, and this seemed the most eerie to Willem. "Well?" the Irishman asked, looking up. "Satisfied?" "Yes," Willem croaked, his voice suddenly hoarse. "Then let's go wet our whistles." Back in the tavern, the same patrons remained, and the burly Kurt glanced sideways from behind the bar at the soldier of fortune hunched over his beer mug. "You should know the history of these places as well as I do," the bounty hunter said. "About how the Norman settlers spread from Markland to the current border of New Sussex and Euskadi. How the war broke out between pagans and Christians, with the Catholics being defeated and driven north. And how Mirkwood was founded, a kingdom of blood, pain, and black magic, so horrifying that even their Viking ancestors would be appalled, and even the red-skinned savages fled west, calling this land wild and bloody. And how the defeated Christians, along with Basque sailors, sent an embassy to the Holy See to organize a crusade. Don't recite a local parish school history lesson, Willem grimaced. I remember how the Order of St. Walpurga was founded. But Mirkwood fell almost 4 centuries ago. Pagan women were given to German settlers, and their children were raised in the true Catholic faith. Now everyone here is a good Christian, well, mostly. I've heard the legends that some pagans fled into the depths of the forests and caves, but that was long ago. And all the fugitives have long since died. Not all, the Irishman whispered fervently. They were hunted down, chased through the woods like wild animals, driven out by European colonists joining the order. But some survived, to become the monsters that frighten children. In Ireland, they talk about the hill people, who steal children from good Catholics' cradles and replace them with their own changelings. Here, these legends have become reality, far more terrifying than any tales of our ancestors. His voice became hollow, as if coming from afar, and Willem van Hyn listened involuntarily, like hearing a scary story. You've heard of the Giant's Cave? I think I'm the first local to penetrate the heart of those caverns and emerge alive. That's the lair of these Inhumans. After almost 500 years of living in caves, they no longer belong to the human race. They worship gods that even their pagan ancestors would shudder at. Those whom the Eddas and sagas mention in frightening hints, speaking of Jotuns, trolls, and dragons. I saw rocks painted with red and black depictions of multi-headed giants, wolves with snake heads and snakes with wolf heads. I saw the descendants of the accursed people bow before them and offer human sacrifices stolen from the surface. We shudder at the pagan rites of the Redskins, at the cruelties of the black shamans of California, but I swear by the providence of God, none have sunk to such satanic depths as this accursed tribe. They worship demons, and have become like them after centuries of inbreeding, cannibalism, and mating with creatures from the abyss. Their men resemble gray bears without fur, but the women are inhumanly, insanely beautiful, as evil can be beautiful. You must have heard stories of men falling in love with elf women, losing their heads to love and longing. But reality is more frightening than old tales. Cave demons lure men into ambushes, only to feast on human flesh with their husbands. But you're alive, Willem said. I wasn't seduced by a cave slut, O'Neill smirked. And God hasn't taken my sanity to touch one of them. The women are priestesses of the cave people. Like the shamans of the Redskins, they can lie motionless for hours while their souls commune with demons. That's how I caught this girl, lying as if dead by the waterfall, under the rock with the white dragon. And now you're taking her to sell? Willem clarified. Aren't you afraid? Me? The Irishman laughed. If I were afraid, I wouldn't have ventured into that cave. Outside, this girl is just a beautiful whore. In 2 days, I'll be in Euskadi, and by evening my employer will take her. She'll make me rich. He laughed again, but it sounded strained. Willem turned away, looking at the rapidly darkening window. Only now did it occur to him that the night of the hunt had just begun. They sat for a while, almost in silence, until Willem felt that fatigue and the beer had finally taken their toll. "Kurt," he called loudly. "You have a free room, don't you?" "Of course." The innkeeper approached the table where the mercenary and the bounty hunter sat, placing a key before Willem. "Third door on the right by the window." "Good." Willem stood up. "I'll leave you to your own devices, Patrick." "As you wish." The Irishman shrugged. "Good night." "This night is never peaceful," the innkeeper said grimly, watching Willem ascend to the second floor. Willem woke up in the middle of the night as if someone had nudged him hard in the side. For a while, he lay on his back, trying to understand what had happened. His eyes adjusted to the darkness, and he quickly scanned the room. Bare walls, a small stool beside his cot, roughly hewn ceiling boards. Nothing suspicious, yet something had woken him. Something that made him break out in a cold sweat and his heart pound wildly. He didn't understand what it was, but he felt danger, seeping into every pore of his body like icy mist. Then he heard it. Though the window was tightly shut with shutters, the sound that woke him was so loud it seemed to be right beside him. It was as if a young woman was sobbing her heart out in his room. The sobs and moans from outside were so mournful that Willem almost got up to open the window, but he froze. His years of ambushes, raids, and night fights had honed his intuition to sense the hidden threat in this sorrowful weeping. Outside, he heard a hoarse neigh, then a man's voice calling out to the unseen weeper. And Willem's blood ran cold. The sobbing abruptly turned into a harsh, triumphant laugh, choking with malevolent glee. There was a flapping of huge wings, a scream of pure terror cut off at its highest note, followed by the crunch of bones and revolting chomping. Without thinking of his own safety, Willem flung the shutters open. The black sky was studded with bright stars, the full moon casting strange shadows. Willem tracked one particularly odd shadow and couldn't suppress a gasp. His hand shot to the weapon lying on the stool as a fantastical, grotesquely hideous creature soared skyward. His hand with the pistol shot up, and he fired at the winged silhouette vanishing into the night. After a few shots, Willem realized he needed to save the bullets for something more tangible. Quickly dressing, the Frisian dashed into the corridor, where he came face to face with O'Neill. "What happened?" he asked, alarmed. "Were you shooting?" "Where's your girl?" Willem demanded. "Sleeping in the room," the Irishman replied warily. "What's it to you?" "She wasn't crying." "She's quiet as usual," Patrick shrugged. "So?" Without answering, Van Hine entered the room and shone the candle on the girl sitting in the corner. She was asleep, and it seemed genuine. Her chest rose and fell evenly. Her breathing was steady. "What the hell happened here?" the Irishman asked, as they quickly descended the stairs together. "I heard screams and crying." "It's what we were warned about," Willem said through gritted teeth. Downstairs, everyone who had been there earlier was still present, apparently not having had time to leave. One of the peasants was missing, and the other, white as marble, was stammering out a story to the gathered patrons of the Red Wolf in a voice that kept breaking into a shriek. "What happened, Hans?" the priest insisted. "What did you see?" "Oh, Lord, there, the peasant repeated like a broken record. The innkeeper poured a full glass of rum and handed it to the villager, who downed it in one gulp, choking and clinking his teeth against the glass. Only then could he manage to say something coherent, though even single-word answers came with great difficulty. Franz went to the horses. I lingered in the doorway. Then this crying. My sister cried like that when she was little. Franz called out, and then like lightning from above, pale as death, wings like Satan's himself, writhing ropes, white like a tangle of worms, a blazing eye, bright blue light. Franz didn't get 2 steps, and oh God in heaven, this thing bit him in half in one go. The last scream came out with the last of his strength, and the peasant, unable to process what he had experienced, collapsed in a faint. The priest looked up at the innkeeper, who grimly nodded in response, uttering just one word. "Snell Geist." The merchant standing nearby gasped and crossed himself, followed by Kurt and the priest. Even Willem flinched at the name he had once dismissed as mere foolish tales. The Irishman looked from one person to another in confusion. "What the hell?" he asked. "What the hell are you all talking about?" "You'd better keep quiet, you Irish dog!" Kurt spat with unexpected fury. "If you hadn't brought that thing here—" "What did you call me, you bastard?" The Irishman, instantly enraged, reached for his weapon. "Stop!" Willem was surprised to hear the priest raise his voice. "When Christians quarrel, the enemy wins the battle. How can you argue when a satanic spawn prowls around like a roaring lion?" Everyone fell into a sullen silence. "Father," Willem began, addressing the priest, but hesitated. "Dominic, my son, the rector of the Neuheim and Kentuckburg diocese." "Father Dominic," the Frisian said respectfully, though it galled him to address a papist that way. "I've heard your peasants mention this creature, but they only crossed themselves at my questions, refusing to explain. What is it?" Dominic darkened, lowering his head. "They call it the Snell Geist, the swift spirit," he said grimly. "They say that on nights like this it crawls out from damp caves, from the banks of underground rivers. Some say it's a god of the red-skinned savages. Others talk of demons worshipped by the Normans. Some even speak of a witch who consorted with the devil and bore this creature. No one knows for sure, only that people disappear at night, and in the morning their bodies are found, mutilated in ways that no human or beast could inflict." Willem remembered the deer's carcass he had found. He couldn't recall exactly what the flying monster looked like. His memory seemed to block out the horrifying, unnatural sight. "What does the Snell Geist look like?" the Frisian finally asked. "Few survive an encounter with it," the priest shook his head. "Those who do describe it differently. Some say it resembles a bird whose wings can cover a small house. Others say the Snell Geist is like a giant bat, a dragon, or all three combined. It has a steel beak and huge teeth. Some say it has hooves. Others claim it has tentacles like an octopus. No one really knows. It's been years since this creature last emerged from its lair." "It wouldn't have come out now," Kurt spat, "if this fool hadn't brought a cave witch into my inn." "If he's a fool, then what are you for letting him in?" The priest raised his voice. "This isn't the time to argue about who's to blame. On the contrary, it's the perfect time." The innkeeper stubbornly shook his head. "If this creature summoned the monster with her spells—" "She's chained hand and foot," the Irishman exclaimed. "And she didn't make a sound while all this was happening. I slept next to her. I'd have heard. She hasn't said a word since she's been captured. Not every summons is spoken aloud." Father Dominic shook his head. "And if this creature is so powerful," Willem asked, "why didn't it wait for us to fall asleep and break in through the windows? Why isn't it trying to get into the house?" Dominic glanced at Kurt, who averted his eyes. "Because on every wall of this house," the innkeeper said hoarsely, "just below the roof there's a hex sign, a 7-pointed star that wards off evil spirits. My grandfather had a hex master carve them for 200 gold gulden when he built this house. Father, I know it's forbidden, but—" "We'll discuss this in the morning, my son," the priest said sternly. "If we have a morning. Will this creature leave with the sunlight?" the merchant asked hopefully. "It emerged on this night, the night of the hunt." "Possibly," Father Dominic shook his head doubtfully. "But—" "Quiet." Willem interrupted. "Do you hear that?" The arguers turned with puzzled expressions but fell silent for a moment. In the ensuing quiet, they heard the flapping of wings, followed by a heavy thud that made dust fall from the ceiling. Then came the scraping of giant claws on the roof, followed by hoofbeats. "It can't break in, can it?" the merchant asked fearfully. "It shouldn't," the innkeeper began, but stopped mid-sentence, mouth agape. Willem understood his reaction. He himself couldn't believe his ears at the sounds that followed. A song. Simply a song. A young female voice from above, harsh, staccato, like the clang of iron, yet strangely mesmerizing. Words in an unknown language seeped through the roof, slipping into the ears of the paralyzed listeners and wrapping around their hearts like cold, slimy leeches, draining their courage and injecting doubt and fear like venom. The hypnotic rhythm was reminiscent of the blasphemous prayers of voodoo priests. But their ritual chants lacked half the hidden, soul-destroying menace, perhaps because they were, after all, human. Gradually, the words of the song began to make sense to Willem. Once, on a distant northern island, he had heard this language. Old ones live in graves, cold corpses, serpents' children. What is it? Willem felt someone tug at his sleeve and turned to see Patrick. What in God's name is this devilry? Lord, save and protect us. Father Dominic made the sign of the cross repeatedly, cold sweat on his brow. Save and protect us. Took out the heart. Bodies gnawed, under wings of the dead. It can't break in. It can't. It can't. It can't, Kurt repeated like a mantra, crossing himself incessantly. He was shaking so violently it seemed everything around him, walls, tables, floor, was trembling with him. But Willem realized the floor was indeed shaking, harder and harder. A bottle of wine fell and shattered on the floor with a crash. What's happening? Patrick shouted in Willem's ear, but Willem couldn't answer in time. A horrific crack sounded and the floorboards exploded, sending splinters flying in all directions. A suffocating stench filled the room as something huge and black crawled out from beneath the floor. Saint Martin, Virgin Mary, Lord Jesus! Terrified screams echoed from all sides. Gunshots rang out, 1, 2, 3. But the corpse-stinking creature seemed unfazed by the bullets. It looked like a long, decayed corpse grown to the size of a large bear. Black-blue, rotting flesh, an almost bare skull with gnashing teeth, fat white worms writhing between the ribs. This blasphemous creature, an affront to the heavens, shouldn't exist. But it lived. It moved. It killed. Huge claws grabbed the nearest merchant, and the creature's teeth sank into his neck. The merchant's scream of mortal pain and terror was cut short as the monster nearly bit off his head in one snap. More gunshots followed, but the creature ignored them, tearing the merchant to shreds. "Be gone!" the priest shouted, holding a cross before him. "Be gone! Be gone!" The monster paid him no heed, growling as it devoured the bloody flesh. Willem involuntarily shook his head, dispelling the illusion. Did it seem to him, or was the creature growing larger with every bite, almost reaching the ceiling? He looked around. The bullets didn't harm it, but perhaps there was another way. The others were useless. Patrick was still firing, the priest muttered prayers, and Kurt was swaying back and forth, white as a sheet, looking ready to collapse into the blazing fireplace behind him. The fireplace. The idea struck Willem like a revelation. He tore a tablecloth from the nearest table, set it ablaze in the fireplace, and threw it over the creature. Simultaneously, he grabbed a fat bottle of whiskey from the bar and hurled it at the monster, which was trying to shake off the burning cloth. Blue flames roared up, turning the undead abomination into a massive bonfire. The creature's menacing growl turned into a pitiful howl, and it bolted for the window. On its way out, it grabbed the still unconscious Hans by the leg, flung him through the window, shattering the shutters, and leaped after him. At that moment, the flapping of wings resumed, and an ugly winged shadow loomed over the courtyard, enveloping the thrashing undead. Willem couldn't resist the temptation to finally see the horror of the night sky. He rushed to the window, knowing he was putting his life in grave danger. But his curiosity overpowered his fear. He reached the window just in time to see the steel-toothed beak clamp down on the head of the still growling undead. A flexible tail, covered in gray-white scales, coiled around the body, holding it tight as the dragon-like creature tore it apart. Willem stared wide-eyed at the Snell Geist. The priest had been right. This monstrosity defied coherent description in human language. It was a bird, a bat, a dragon, an octopus, all at once. Its shape shifted bizarrely, presenting a different appearance every second. Pieces of bodies littered the courtyard, shredded horses and the unfortunate peasant Franz, who had stepped out at the sound of the woman's crying. His brother, thrown out by the rampaging undead, was miraculously still alive. He had regained consciousness and managed to stagger a few steps toward the inn. But that was all he could do. The monster turned its hideous face towards him, and its single eye, burning with a dark blue fire, flared in the center of its forehead. Around its grotesque skull, many small tendrils began to writhe and extend. These tendrils quickly grew longer and thicker, transforming the creature into a gorgon-like horror. The hapless German barely managed a couple of steps before the white tentacles wrapped around his body. His agonized scream turned into a gurgling gasp as his body arched, and the tendrils turned red as they drained his blood. A noise behind Willem made him turn to see Father Dominic, red with anger, confronting a sheepishly defensive Kurt. "I didn't know! I swear to God I didn't know!" the innkeeper yelled. "Don't invoke the name of the Lord!" the priest shouted back. "You, spawn of Satan! You invited a hexmaster, didn't you? What else did you keep silent about? That he not only carved your signs, but also killed a man to bury in the house's foundation? You wanted a guardian for your inn. Well, did he protect Heinrich?" He pointed to the torn body of the merchant. "And Hans? And Franz? Do you think he'll protect you?" "But I truly didn't know." The innkeeper still tried to justify himself. "It was all my grandfather's doing." "Blasphemer? Sorcerer? And you still hope to see the morning?" "What are they talking about?" the Irishman asked, nodding towards the arguing men. "There's a belief," Willem said distractedly, "that if you kill someone and bury them in the foundation when building a house, it will stand for centuries. And if you invite a knowledgeable person, the spirit of the slain will become a guardian. No one will admit to doing this now, of course, but everyone knows half the local barons' castles stand on." Willem froze mid-sentence, looking out the window again, where the creature was still devouring the peasant's corpse. A sudden realization struck him. Damn it, how foolish he'd been. He thundered up the stairs, boots clattering. "Where are you going?" the Irishman shouted. "To see your witch." "Why?" "He's right," Kurt supported Willem. "I want to see too." "And I," added the priest. Scowling at the three men, the Irishman led them back upstairs. Kurt opened the door and shone the candle inside. The cave girl lay curled up under the window. Her head twitched, her slender throat swelled and fell, and her neck arched as her jaws snapped as if biting something. Willem remembered the California alligators. This was exactly how they swallowed chunks of flesh torn from corpses. A blush appeared on the witch's pale cheeks, and her thin lips were turning red before their eyes. Willem shook his head, approached the window, careful not to touch the cave spawn, and tore the cover from it. The full moon shone brightly in the sky, illuminating the courtyard where the creature spread its wings and soared into the night. The writhing white tendrils fluttered behind its grotesque head like a multitude of long maiden braids. "There's your Snell Geist," Willem said grimly, nodding at the sleeping cave girl. "Patrick, you really are a fool." "What are you talking about?" the Irishman asked, casually laying a hand on his pistol. "Tell me again. How did you catch her?" "Well, she was lying asleep under the rock," the Irishman began. "Have you never heard that a witch might have more than one soul?" Willem interrupted. "All pagans believe that. Some say a witch or a sorcerer is born with it, while others say it's a demon given to them after initiation. From their own blood and the remains of various creatures, The sorcerer creates a body for their second soul. The Snell Geist is such a creature. Willem threw his hand toward the window. This beast is one with your captive. Oh God! Kurt crossed himself with a trembling hand, and the priest began muttering a prayer. The captive girl stirred, her knees drawn up, her predatory eyes warily shifting from one person to another. With a shudder, Willem realized that the underground witch understood perfectly what they were saying. "What are you talking about?" the Irishman exclaimed. "How can that be? Did you see that creature? Did you see the undead thing tear a man apart like a rotten rag? Why ask stupid questions? Your greed and ignorance will doom us all. If that's the case, why didn't it devour me right away?" O'Neill persisted. "In the cave or on the way out?" "I don't know." Willem shrugged. "Maybe. Who knows where this witch sent her second soul? Perhaps into such depths that the creature couldn't get out quickly. By the time it started looking for you, you were already on the surface. And during the day," added Father Dominic. "But on the witching night, the foul thing came out. Willem was right. You're a fool." Okay, I admit it," the Irishman nodded hastily. "I messed up, but still, the creature can't get into the house and it will disappear by morning. Then I can continue my journey." Kurt cursed elaborately, and Willem agreed with him. The Irishman's carelessness was infuriating. Yes, they both were used to staring death in the face, but this was far from an ordinary death. Willem saw that Patrick was as scared as the rest of them, but greed and stubbornness wouldn't let him accept the loss of his goods. "Look!" the priest exclaimed. "What's happening to her again?" Willem looked at the girl. She had gone limp in her chains, her head drooping to the side. Her eyes were glazed, a thin stream of saliva ran from the corner of her mouth, but her chest heaved as if she had been running for a long time. A wheezing, whistling breath escaped her lips. Willem rushed to the window and opened the shutters. A full moon bathed his face in light, and against its pale glow, a winged silhouette was clearly approaching. The night was once again pierced by a terrible scream. "Is it getting bigger?" Kurt exclaimed in amazement. "Yes." Willem squinted, observing the creature, which had indeed nearly doubled in size. "The legends said so," the priest nodded grimly. "The Snell Geist came, no bigger than a crane, but as it devoured people it grew to the size of a house, and its sorcery grew with it. Now even your hex sign may not help, Kurt." "Damn." The innkeeper glanced nervously at the window. "Don't curse." "What should we do?" the Irishman exclaimed, seemingly resigned to the loss of his goods. "Give the girl to the Snell Geist," Willem said decisively. "Maybe it will be satisfied." "No!" The priest's voice was unexpectedly firm. "Never." "Why not?" "This house is already excessively desecrated by witchcraft," said Father Dominic, his eyes gleaming with fanatical light. "We won't damn our souls by bargaining with this creature." "Bargaining. No matter what this witch is, she didn't come to us from the cave. She was dragged here by force. We're already guilty before her." "Don't blaspheme." The priest's voice cracked like a whip. "I know all Frisians are heretics, but I didn't think they were ready to surrender to the enemy. It doesn't matter how this witch ended up here. She's a devil's spawn, and it is the true Christian's duty to destroy her. God probably instilled excessive greed in the Irishman to deliver this cave witch into our hands. Our ancestors didn't eradicate this filth with fire and sword for us to grovel before it now." "And what are you going to do with her?" "Her fate is the stake. Maybe then God will allow us to see the morning." Willem glanced from the girl on the floor to the faces of his companions. and saw they fully agreed with the priest. Even the Irishman's papist inclinations resurfaced, despite his many years as a mercenary. Like Kurt, facing dark forces, he was ready to acknowledge Father Dominic as their spiritual leader. All three tried to drown their panic with religious fanaticism. "Over my dead body." Willem stepped forward, reaching for his pistol, but all three men lunged at him. He managed to fire, but at that moment something heavy struck the back of his head. A bright flash exploded before his eyes, and everything went black. In nomine Patris et Spiritus Sancti. A multitude of sounds broke through the thick darkness of unconsciousness. Half-familiar Latin words of a prayer mingled with metallic clanging and pitiful wailing. Willem opened his eyes, barely managing to separate his lashes, sticky with dried blood, and looked around. He was lying in the downstairs hall, thrown onto one of the tables, bound hand and foot like a Christmas goose. The Frisian turned his head, almost gasping from the excruciating pain pulsating through his skull. "Judica, Domine, expugna impugnantes." Kurt was busy at the fireplace, throwing log after log into the growing flames. Next to him, as if lined up for a final battle, stood numerous bottles of various shapes and sizes. Evidently, the innkeeper had raided his cellar extensively. Father Dominic stood nearby, detached from all worldly matters as a true spiritual shepherd, reciting prayers over the Irishman sitting on the floor. "Sancte Michael Archangele, adversus principes et potestates, contra spiritualia nequitiae." Listening to the priest, Patrick O'Neill held the cave girl by her long hair. Even bound hand and foot, the witch's serpentine, boneless writhing made it difficult for the bounty hunter to keep her under control. From her crimson lips, still no sound emerged, and this silent, desperate struggle had a particularly eerie quality. "Exe crucem Domini, fugite partes." In response, from outside came maniacal laughter and a woman sobbing, howling, whistling, furious cursing as if spewed by 100 mouths. Wings flapped, huge claws scraped the wall, and an enormous blue eye, filled with hatred for humanity, appeared repeatedly in the shattered window. However, the creature couldn't break in. The hexmaster who had carved the protective symbols on the house walls knew his craft. The trio at the fireplace did their best to ignore the monster, though the priest's voice trembled, and the innkeeper's hands shook as he stoked the fire. They tried not to look at Willem, only Kurt, noticeably limping, cast a resentful glance at the Frisian. Willem noticed his right leg was wrapped in a cloth, a dark stain spreading across it. Evidently his shot had found its mark. The incoherent yells outside turned into loud chanting, reminiscent of the chants the Snell Geist had used to raise the undead from under the floor. The walls shook again. Dust rose in clouds. But through it, Willem saw something strange happening to the inn. At first he thought his eyes were deceiving him, but no. He clearly saw pale gray spots forming on the walls and ceiling, quickly turning tar black. They expanded, merging, covering the walls with oily blots and streaks, emitting a nauseating stench. Willem looked up and saw black drops swelling on the ceiling above him. One fell next to him on the table, the fine spray burning his skin like hot oil. Shuddering, he thought about what would happen if this filth got into his eyes. Meanwhile, the oily substance defied nature, rolling across the ceiling in black globules like mercury, converging into a single spot on the wall above the tightly closed door near the ceiling. There, under a layer of foul-smelling slime, a faint golden 7-pointed star glowed. The priest, the innkeeper, and the bounty hunter were just as terrified as Willem, but unlike him, they could at least do something. The priest finished his prayer, crossing the Irishman and the struggling witch with a sweeping motion, the girl now barely resembling a human. The fire roared in the fireplace as Kurt turned around, holding something Willem initially mistook for another log. But it wasn't a log. It was an axe. From the crazed glint in the innkeeper's eyes, Willem realized that Kurt had lost his mind from all they had been through. The Irishman threw the girl at the innkeeper's feet, and she rolled across the floor, struggling to stand. At that moment, with a deranged grimace, Kurt brought the axe down with a shuddering sob. A deafening, shrieking scream echoed from outside, the creature's massive body slamming against the wall, shaking the house. Spurred on by the scream, Kurt repeatedly swung the axe, delivering brutal blows. Soon, his hands, face, and chest were covered in blood, but he kept hacking at the body, thrashing at his feet like a decapitated snake. Blood splattered on the priest's cassock, and droplets hit his face. But Father Dominic, seemingly oblivious, continued his prayer, crossing Kurt and the dying witch with sweeping motions and crossing himself. Exorcizamus te, omnis immundus spiritus, omnis satanica potestas, omnis incursio infernalis adversarii, omnis legio, omnis congregatio, in nomine et virtute Domini nostri. Kurt, now in a frenzy, chopped off the witch's hands and feet, hacked the torn body apart, spilling its innards. The Irishman grabbed the severed pieces of flesh and threw them into the fire. When Kurt was exhausted, Patrick snatched the axe from him and continued to hack at the bloodied, writhing pile on the floor. Incredibly, the dismembered creature still lived, still twitched and writhed, and so did the Snell Geist outside, howling in agony. Willem knew the local superstition. Demons possessing a witch's body could be reborn from the smallest part of her flesh. Just burning the body was not enough. Every limb had to be separated, every bone scattered to leave no way for the evil spirit to return. The land of the Confederacy preserved many secret rites and strange customs, and Willem realized that the cursed legacy of Mirkvid had not only survived in the caves. The sorcery of the defeated Northerners had taken root among the descendants of the crusading order. The black slime accumulating around the hex sign finally ate through the wood, breaking the magical protection. There was a cracking sound and a gnashing skull, its flesh bubbling from the heat, pushed through the hole near the ceiling. The creature lunged inside, but the axe fell once more. Covered in blood, the Irishman straightened, holding the girl's head by her hair. Strangely, her face remained unscathed, as inhumanly beautiful as it had been in life. Cursing, the Irishman slammed the severed head onto the floor, then struck it with the axe and threw the shattered skull into the fire. The light hair, curling like dying snakes, crackled and flared up in the flames. Shuddering with revulsion, Willem glanced at the door. There was a gaping hole above it, but the vile face was gone. The black stains on the ceiling dried up before his eyes, crumbling into dark dust. From outside came incoherent muttering, increasingly drowned out by the priest's voice. Draco maledicte et omnis legio diabolica, adjuramus te per deum vivum, per deum verum. Mutilated chunks of flesh flew into the fire, where Kurt poured the contents of opened bottles. Navarrese rum, Dorian grappa, whiskey, schnapps. The entire stock of strong drinks the innkeeper had went into fueling the enormous pyre, purifying the demon-tainted flesh. The Irishman did the same, taking a swig from each bottle before tossing it. Kurt, unable to bear the horror sober, drank as well. Only by some miracle did the fire not spread beyond the hearth. Silence fell outside. The priest finished his prayer, crossed himself, and with difficulty got up and approached Willem. The Frisian tensed, seeing the knife in his hand. "Don't worry, my son." The priest bowed his head. "I won't harm you. It was a vile deed, but God knows it was necessary. "Untie me," Willem croaked, and Father Dominic, hesitating, began to cut the ropes, avoiding eye contact with the Frisian. Finished, the priest hurriedly stepped back, but even if Willem had wanted to, he couldn't do anything to him. His limbs, bound tightly by the ropes, took time to regain proper blood flow. Ignoring Kurt and Patrick, who watched him warily, Willem van Hyn walked to the shattered window and looked outside. Before the inn, in a pool of dark pink pus, lay a decaying mass of flesh and crumbling bones. Willem lifted his eyes. The night sky was lightening, and in the distance, beyond the tree branches, the faint glow of dawn shimmered. Willem left the Red Wolf Inn without a word, not exchanging a single word with anyone. No one seemed inclined to talk. Patrick brooded over his beer. Kurt started cleaning up the thoroughly soiled inn, still limping and glaring at the Frisian. Only the priest tried once more to speak with the mercenary, but Willem gestured that he didn't want to talk. During the day, Willem bought a sturdy bay mare in Neuheim and headed north, crossing the borders of baronies and bishoprics, passing mighty castles perched on cliff tops, carefully avoiding towns and villages. He only looked back once, at the end of the first day, when he climbed to the top of a large hill. Behind him the sun was setting, painting the sky a bloody crimson. Patrick hoped to drown the recent horror in drink. By evening, drunk on beer, he collapsed onto his bed and quickly fell asleep. A terrible scream from Patrick's room made Kurt drop his bottle of wine and rush upstairs. With shaking hands, he unlocked the door with a spare key and stepped inside. By the window lay the Irishman's body, mutilated and broken as if crushed with immense force. Uninjured patches of flesh alternated with horrifying bruises and contusions, red-blue streaks wrapping around the corpse. The mess of skin, flesh, and shattered bones, fragments protruding from the mangled flesh. The blackened, rigid tongue lolled out of his mouth, frozen in a silent scream. Kurt's eyes caught on a small white spot next to the mangled body. He bent down, picking up the strange object, a large, coin-sized hard scale. Behind him came a rustling sound that made the innkeeper's blood run cold. Slowly, as if walking to the gallows, Kurt turned. His eyes widened, his mouth opened, but he didn't have time to scream. Willem smirked, recalling his conversation with O'Neill. The Irishman had traveled so long away from his kin that it was no wonder he got the date of the Celtic Day of the Dead wrong, rashly linking it with the local legend. A mistake, true, only by one day. But even that could be fatal. "It seems to me, Patrick, that you got off easy," the Frisian muttered, reaching into his saddlebag. When he withdrew his hand, it held a lock of light hair, strangely glinting in the setting sun's rays. Willem had picked it up and absently shoved it into his bag when he went up to retrieve his belongings that morning. Apparently, when the three men dragged the cave witch downstairs, she had fought back, leaving clumps of hair stained with someone's blood on the steps. Willem opened his fingers. The lock of hair flew into the bushes, writhing like a snake in the air. Moments later, from the dense thickets came a loud hissing, and the branches swayed as if a strong body was forcing its way through them. As if compelled by some unseen force, Willem raised his head and looked at the peaks of the distant hills. Did it seem to him, or did a shadow of a giant rider in a knight's helmet really flicker there, followed by a ghostly pack of some unidentifiable creatures? The vision disappeared as quickly as it had appeared, but Willem was certain it was real. The mercenary shook his head and spurred his horse. Behind him lay the enchanted south, with its undead witches and winged monsters spreading terror in the night. Ahead awaited dense forests and vast lakes, great battles, and a normal enemy who died from a simple, honest bullet. Ahead lay Frisia. Patrick decided not to leave Neuheim immediately. After losing his goods, it was better not to show his face to his employer. However, he still had the money from the advance payment, and since he had paid for his room for 3 days in advance, he decided to stay at the Red Wolf, especially as Kurt wasn't accepting visitors while he put the inn back in order.